At dawn, the waters of the Bosporus once caught the light like liquid gold. The domes of Constantinople glowed against the horizon, a city so dazzling that travelers called it the eye of the world. From its marble palaces and echoing cathedrals flowed orders that shaped empires, faiths, and continents. For 1,000 years, it stood as the beating heart of civilization, neither fully Roman nor entirely Greek, yet something greater, Byzantine. And then one day, it was gone. When the final cannons of the Ottomans thundered in 1453, they didn't just shatter walls, they ended an age. The city that had withstood countless sieges fell silent. Its mosaics, once gleaming under candlelight, were swallowed by shadow. Yet the strangest part of the Byzantine story isn't its fall, it's how quickly the world forgot it. The empire that preserved Roman law, guarded ancient philosophy, and gave birth to Orthodox Christianity faded from memory, like a ghost erased from history's parchment. In Western chronicles, the 1,000-year reign of Byzantium became a footnote, dismissed as decadent, alien, or irrelevant. But how could a civilization that outlasted Rome by centuries simply vanish from the collective mind? This is where our story begins, not with collapse, but with survival. The Byzantines inherited a dying Rome and turned it into something new, an empire of intellect and faith. They built libraries when Europe burned, invented secret weapons that terrified their enemies, and blended politics with theology until the two were indistinguishable. They were philosophers and warriors, saints and schemers. Their emperors wore crowns of gold but ruled from thrones surrounded by intrigue. Their courtiers whispered prophecies, their generals plotted coups, and their monks debated the nature of God, while armies gathered outside the city's walls. Yet beneath the grandeur lay fragility, an empire perpetually balancing between East and West, between divine purpose and human greed. It was a world of contradictions, deeply spiritual, yet ruthlessly pragmatic, endlessly cultured, yet constantly at war. To understand Byzantium is to confront the question every great power must face. How does a civilization so advanced, so self-assured, slowly fade into silence? Was it crushed by external enemies, betrayed by its own faith, or simply worn down by the weight of time? Over the next chapters, we'll trace the empire's rise from the ashes of Rome, its golden age under emperors who dreamed of divine destiny, and the long twilight of decline that led to its forgotten fall. Along the way, we'll uncover secrets that history buried, tales of courage and treachery, innovation and obsession, belief and doubt. The Byzantine Empire was more than an echo of Rome. It was a world unto itself, glittering, dangerous, and utterly human. And though its walls have crumbled, its shadow still stretches across our world in ways most have never noticed. This is the story of the empire that refused to die, until it did. The 3rd century after Christ was an age of unraveling. Across the once mighty Roman world, the illusion of eternal power was breaking apart. Cities that had stood for centuries burned, provinces rebelled, generals betrayed their emperors, and emperors murdered their generals. The frontiers trembled beneath waves of barbarian invasions. Goths from the north, Persians from the east. Plague and famine hollowed out the heart of the empire, while inflation shredded the economy. Rome itself, the eternal city, felt old, exhausted, and haunted by its own grandeur. By the time Diocletian rose to power in 284 CE, the empire was less a body than a battlefield. He tried to save it by dividing it, creating the tetrarchy, 4 rulers sharing the burden of command. It was a desperate act of surgery to keep the dying giant alive. For a moment it worked, but beneath the surface, ambition and distrust festered. When Diocletian retired, the only Roman emperor to do so voluntarily, the empire he tried to stabilize collapsed back into chaos. Out of this turmoil emerged a young general, Constantine, the son of a Roman officer and a woman from the eastern provinces. He was a man of 2 worlds. Latin in his command, Greek in his mind. He rose through blood and battle, winning civil wars against rivals who claimed the throne in the name of the old gods. His victory at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE became the stuff of legend. On the eve of battle, he saw a symbol in the sky, a cross of light, and the words in hoc signo vinces, "In this sign, you shall conquer." It was not just a vision, it was the hinge of history. When Constantine entered Rome as emperor, he came not as another pagan warlord, but as a man touched by the Christian God. He legalized Christianity, ended centuries of persecution, and began to weave this once marginal faith into the fabric of imperial power. To the Roman elite, it was unthinkable, an emperor kneeling before a single god instead of the pantheon. But Constantine saw what others didn't, that Rome's salvation lay not in its old traditions but in something new. He needed a symbol for this rebirth, a place untainted by the politics and decay of the old capital. His eyes turned eastward, toward a narrow strip of land where Europe and Asia almost touched. There, on the site of an ancient Greek colony called Byzantium, Constantine envisioned a city that would stand as the bridge between worlds. It was perfectly placed, defensible, rich in trade, and connected to both continents. In 330 CE, he dedicated his new capital, Nova Roma Constantinopolitana, New Rome, soon known simply as Constantinople. To mark its birth, he staged ceremonies blending Roman ritual with Christian prayer. Statues of pagan gods still stood beside crosses. Senators from the West mingled with Greek philosophers. It was a deliberate paradox, not a rejection of Rome, but its transformation. The city rose like a dream from the waters. Massive walls girded its 7 hills, aqueducts fed fountains and baths. A vast hippodrome thundered with chariot races that rivaled those of the Circus Maximus. At its heart stood the great palace, a labyrinth of marble halls, mosaics, and gilded domes. And in the center of the city, a new forum bore Constantine's name. At its heart stood a towering column, topped with a statue of the emperor himself, crowned not with a laurel, but with the rays of the sun. A symbol that fused Christ with Apollo, empire with eternity. It was both continuity and revolution, Rome reborn, yet different in soul. Constantine's reforms extended far beyond architecture. He reorganized the army, separating its frontier troops from elite mobile legions ready to strike anywhere in the empire. He stabilized the currency, imposed new taxes, and centralized bureaucracy around the emperor's authority. The empire, once fractured, now revolved around a single sacred ruler. The emperor was no longer merely a man. He was the chosen of God, standing between heaven and earth. But this new order carried a hidden cost. The fusion of throne and altar gave the empire unity, but it also bound its fate to religious conflict. As Christianity spread, debates over doctrine became battles for the empire's soul. Was Christ divine, human, or both? Could the Son be equal to the Father? These questions tore bishops, cities, and armies apart. Constantine himself presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Summoning hundreds of bishops to settle the question of Christ's nature, they emerged with the Nicene Creed, a declaration of faith that still echoes in churches today. But the wounds it opened never truly healed. As Constantine aged, his vision of divine empire began to darken. He ordered the execution of his own son Crispus under suspicion of treason, a shadow that haunted his legacy. When he finally died in 337 CE, he was baptized on his deathbed, entering history as both the first Christian emperor and the last true unifier of the Roman world. After his death, the empire split again among his sons, east and west drifting apart like tectonic plates. The Latin-speaking West clung to Rome, while the Greek-speaking East anchored itself in Constantinople. The division ran deeper than language. It was cultural, spiritual, philosophical. The West prized law and conquest, the East, theology and diplomacy. Out of this tension, a new identity began to form. The people of the East no longer called themselves Romans in the old sense, nor Greeks in the ancient one. They were Romaioi, Romans of a new kind, heirs to Caesar yet servants of Christ. As the Western Empire slid toward ruin, the East adapted. It faced invasions from Goths and Huns, earthquakes and epidemics, yet Constantinople endured. Its wealth drew enemies, but its walls defied them all. The Theodosian walls, built in the early 5th century, turned the city into an unbreakable fortress. Triple layers of stone and towers stretching for miles. When Attila the Hun's armies thundered across Europe, Constantinople stood untaken, a city of miracles in a world of ruin. Meanwhile, the Western Empire rotted from within. Corruption spread, loyalty dissolved, and barbarian generals carved out kingdoms on Roman soil. In 410 CE, Alaric's Visigoths sacked Rome itself, the unthinkable made real. To the people of the East, it was a sign. The torch of empire had passed. While the West burned, the East survived. But survival came at a price. Refugees poured into Constantinople, swelling its population and straining its resources. Bureaucrats multiplied, taxes climbed, and intrigue poisoned the court. The Senate of Constantinople became a theater of vanity and betrayal. Ambitious generals staged coups. Eunuchs whispered plots in marble corridors. The empire's enemies watched and waited. In 447 CE, nature itself turned against them. A massive earthquake shattered the city's walls, toppling towers and leaving breaches hundreds of feet wide. The Huns advanced toward the capital, sensing blood. Panic swept through Constantinople. But then came one of those moments that defined Byzantium's spirit. Within 60 days, driven by faith, fear, and sheer determination, the people rebuilt the walls, stronger than before. The Huns arrived to find an unbroken fortress and turned away in disbelief. That was Byzantium's pattern. Fall, rebuild, endure. The world would call it decline, but for the Byzantines, it was resurrection. Like the phoenix that adorned their mosaics, they believed destruction was only another beginning. Through the 4th and 5th centuries, this identity hardened. The emperors of the East saw themselves as the guardians of civilization, the chosen defenders of the true faith. They inherited Rome's crown but wrapped it in silk and prayer. Latin titles still appeared on their coins, but their hearts beat in Greek rhythms. Their armies prayed before icons. Their generals dreamed of saints. The first great test of this new empire came not from within, but from the north. The Gothic invasions. When the Goths, displaced by the Huns, crossed the Danube seeking refuge, mismanagement and cruelty by Roman officials turned them into rebels. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, Emperor Valens marched out to crush them. He refused to wait for reinforcements from the west, confident in Roman might. The result was catastrophe. The Gothic cavalry annihilated the Roman legions. Valens himself was killed, his body lost in the flames. It was one of Rome's worst defeats, a reminder that even the eastern half was not invincible. Yet from disaster came adaptation. The Byzantines learned. They began to rely less on massive legions and more on flexible strategies, diplomacy, intelligence, and gold. They bought peace when necessary, played enemies against each other, and mastered survival through subtlety rather than brute force. By the dawn of the 5th century, the transformation was complete. The Byzantine Empire was no longer just Rome's eastern twin. It was something else entirely. Its capital gleamed as the richest city in the world. Its bureaucracy was unmatched, its religion fervent, its identity forged in both triumph and trauma. It was an empire reborn in fire and faith. In its first centuries, Byzantium had faced every trial imaginable: civil war, invasion, heresy, and corruption. Yet, it endured. Each time it seemed ready to fall, it rose again, reshaped and renewed. It was a civilization built on the conviction that survival itself was sacred. And as the dust settled over the ruins of the old Roman world, one truth became clear: the empire of the West had died, but in the East, the phoenix of Rome still burned. By the middle of the 6th century, Constantinople had become the envy of the known world. Its towers pierced the horizon like spears of marble and gold, and its harbor, the Golden Horn, shimmered with fleets from every corner of the Mediterranean. The markets overflowed with silks from China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic, and ivory from Africa. Merchants spoke in dozens of tongues beneath the colonnades, and priests debated the mysteries of heaven in smoky courtyards. From afar, it seemed a city touched by the divine. At its heart ruled Emperor Justinian, a man who dreamed not merely of power, but of eternity. Born a peasant in the Balkans, he had climbed through the ranks with relentless brilliance. He saw himself not as a caretaker of the empire, but as its restorer, the chosen vessel through which God would return Rome to its former glory. His reign from 527 to 565 would become a paradox, an era of splendor and suffering, wisdom and ruin, faith and fire. At his side stood Empress Theodora, one of the most extraordinary women in history. Once an actress and courtesan, she rose from the lowest depths of society to share the imperial throne. She was sharp, fearless, and politically ruthless, the steel beneath Justinian's velvet. The court called her a scandal. Justinian called her indispensable. Together, they ruled as co-sovereigns, the empire's most unlikely power couple. He, the visionary; she, the survivor. Justinian's ambitions were breathtaking. He sought nothing less than to reunite the old Roman world, the shattered provinces of the West that had fallen to barbarian kings. But conquest in his mind was not only about armies, it was about order, faith, and law. His empire would be one in which the word of God and the word of the emperor marched side by side. The first step was legal. Centuries of imperial decrees, senatorial edicts, and conflicting precedents had turned Roman law into chaos. Justinian summoned a commission of scholars led by the Juris Tribonian to cleanse and codify it all. After years of labor, they produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It became the foundation of modern legal systems, a monument to reason and order that outlasted the empire itself. Yet while the ink of law dried, the streets of Constantinople seethed. Taxes rose to fund Justinian's ambitions. The army demanded gold. So did the architects, engineers, and clergy who built his grand projects. Bureaucrats squeezed merchants, landowners, and peasants alike. Corruption flourished. The city grew restless. In January 532, that tension erupted. The spark came from the Hippodrome, the massive arena where tens of thousands gathered to cheer for their favorite chariot teams, the Blues and the Greens. These were not mere sports factions. They were political tribes, symbols of class, religion, and loyalty. When Justinian cracked down on rioters from both sides, they united against him. What began as a protest became an uprising, the Nika riots. For 5 days, Constantinople burned. The mob crowned a rival emperor, Hypatius, and demanded Justinian's resignation. Fires devoured half the city, the air filled with screams and smoke. In the palace, Justinian wavered, ready to flee across the sea, but Theodora refused. In one of the most famous moments in Byzantine history, she spoke calmly before the trembling court. "Royal purple," she said, "makes a fine burial shroud." Her words cut through fear like a blade. Justinian steeled himself, and together they struck back. The general Belisarius, young, brilliant, and utterly loyal, lured the rebels into the Hippodrome with promises of mercy. Then, with the gates sealed, his troops slaughtered them. By the time the dust settled, 30,000 bodies lay in the arena. The rebellion was dead. So was any illusion that Justinian's rule was fragile. When the smoke cleared, he rebuilt, grander than ever. Out of ashes rose the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Its dome seemed to float upon light itself, an architectural miracle unmatched in the ancient world. When Justinian first entered the completed basilica in 537, he gazed at its glittering mosaics and whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." It was not merely a church. It was a declaration of divine empire, a testament that heaven itself favored Byzantium. But glory demanded sacrifice. While the emperor built, his empire bled. To reclaim the West, he launched a series of campaigns led by Belisarius. first against the Vandals in North Africa, then the Ostrogoths in Italy. The victories were stunning. Carthage fell swiftly. Rome, abandoned and desolate, returned to imperial hands after a century of barbarian rule. For a brief, heady moment, it seemed as though Justinian had succeeded, that the dream of a united Roman world was alive again. Yet the triumph was hollow. The wars drained the treasury, devastated cities, and left fields barren. The Italian campaign in particular became a nightmare of sieges and starvation. The Gothic War dragged on for nearly 2 decades, transforming once prosperous Italy into a wasteland. When the dust settled, Byzantine banners flew over the ruins, but the land was broken, its people exhausted, its economy shattered. Even as armies fought in the west, another war raged within, a war of faith. Theological disputes tore the empire apart. The Council of Chalcedon, a century earlier, had declared that Christ possessed both divine and human natures, united in one person. But not all agreed. Egypt, Syria, and Armenia rejected the council's decision, insisting on the single divine nature of Christ, the monophysite belief. To Justinian, these divisions were intolerable. The empire's strength, he believed, depended on spiritual unity. He tried to reconcile the factions through decrees, councils, and compromises, but each move only deepened the rift. The more he reached for unity, the more the empire fractured. Theological disputes turned into riots, schisms, and persecutions. Priests became political enemies. Heresy became treason. The dream of one faith under one emperor slipped further away. Then came the unseen enemy. In 541, death arrived on the wind, the plague of Justinian. It struck Constantinople without warning, spreading from port to port along trade routes. At its height, 5,000 people died each day. The air stank of decay. Ships floated unmanned in the harbor, their crews dead below deck. Justinian himself caught the disease and nearly died. Theodora ruled in his stead while the empire trembled. When the plague finally passed, it left devastation beyond measure. Farms lay empty, armies dwindled, trade collapsed. For the first time in centuries, the streets of Constantinople fell silent. The empire's strength, its people, had been cut in half. Yet somehow, Byzantium endured. Justinian emerged weakened but unbroken. He turned his focus inward, strengthening administration, rebuilding cities, and reasserting control. His law codes spread order even as his armies waned. Theodora, before her death in 548, championed reforms for women, granting them property rights, protection from exploitation, and a voice in the courts. Hers was a quiet revolution, almost invisible in the chronicles, but profound in legacy. Still, as the emperor aged, the light began to dim. His dream of universal empire had cost too much. The western provinces he fought to reclaim slipped away again after his death. The treasury was empty, the army thin, and the provinces restless. His reign had reached for the divine but left behind exhaustion. An empire gilded with glory but hollowed by strain. Yet even in decline, Justinian's Byzantium radiated brilliance. The mosaics of Ravenna shimmered with celestial gold. The scholars of Constantinople preserved the works of Plato and Aristotle. Engineers built aqueducts, domes, and cisterns that defied time. In the monasteries of Mount Athos, monks copied sacred texts by lamplight, keeping the flame of knowledge alive, while much of Europe still slept in darkness. This was the paradox of the Byzantine Golden Age. Its splendor rested on suffering. Every triumph demanded sacrifice. Every monument rose over the bones of laborers. Every hymn of praise echoed with the cry of the taxed and the conquered. The Byzantines believed themselves chosen by God, but their empire was built by human hands that trembled under the weight of divine ambition. As the 6th century waned, the empire stood resplendent yet vulnerable. The frontiers strained under new pressures. Slavs in the Balkans, Persians in the east, Lombards in Italy. The court, once united by Justinian's iron will, splintered into factions. Faith turned to dogma, and vision turned to memory. When Justinian died in 565, He was buried beside Theodora in a tomb adorned with gold and jewels. But his empire no longer stretched from Spain to Syria. What remained was smaller, poorer, yet still dazzling, still defiant. His successors would inherit both the glory and the burden of his reign. In the centuries that followed, Byzantium would never again command such vast dominion. But its spirit, that fusion of Roman discipline, Greek intellect, and Christian faith, endured. It was an empire convinced that it stood at the center of God's plan, a city of light in a world of shadows. And yet, deep beneath the marble floors of Hagia Sophia, the cracks had already begun to form. The taxes that built the empire's wonders had bred resentment. The wars that reclaimed Rome had drained its lifeblood. The faith that bound it together would one day tear it apart. The Byzantines had reached for heaven and found it heavy to hold. But for now, in the glow of Justinian's empire, the world believed that the phoenix had truly risen, its wings gilded with gold, its heart burning with faith. By the dawn of the 7th century, the empire that once ruled from the sands of Egypt to the gates of Spain stood surrounded by shadows. The old Roman world was gone, and the Byzantines, those heirs to its legacy, now faced a storm unlike any before. The golden domes of Constantinople gleamed over the Bosporus, but beneath their brilliance lay unease. Beyond the deserts, a new faith was rising, a force of fervor and speed that would sweep across continents. Islam. The Arab caliphates moved like wildfire. Within decades, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, the empire's richest provinces, were gone. Ancient cities that had once sent grain to feed Constantinople now echoed with Arabic prayers. The Byzantines, who had long seen themselves as the chosen guardians of the true faith, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against an enemy who believed the same. Yet, even as the empire staggered, it refused to fall. From the ashes of defeat came adaptation. Emperor Heraclius, a man of grit and vision, reformed the military and redefined the state. No longer would armies be drawn from distant corners of the empire. Instead, soldiers were granted land to defend their regions, a system that would become the themes, and it was survival through transformation. The Romans had relied on legions, the Byzantines on endurance. Then came a weapon that bordered on myth, Greek fire. A substance so fearsome, so secret, it burned even upon water. When Arab fleets stormed the Bosporus, Byzantine ships unleashed liquid flame that turned night into day and sea into hell. Chroniclers wrote that the fire roared like living beasts, clinging to men and ships alike. It wasn't just a military miracle. It was divine providence made manifest. To the Byzantines, it confirmed what they had always believed. God still favored them. But survival had its cost. Centuries of siege left the empire scarred. The capital endured blockade after blockade, famine after famine. To outsiders, Constantinople seemed unbreakable, a city ringed by triple walls and faith unshaken. Inside, however, ambition and paranoia ate at its heart. Eunuchs whispered in marble corridors, priests plotted in candlelit chambers, and generals, ever hungry for power, turned their armies on the throne rather than the frontier. The palace became a theater of intrigue. There were emperors blinded, in their sleep, sons overthrowing fathers, and patriarchs excommunicating emperors one week and blessing them the next. Byzantium's brilliance lay not just in art or theology, but in politics. They turned survival into an art form, diplomacy into weaponry. A Byzantine emissary could play Bulgars against Franks, Persians against Arabs, without lifting a sword. Still, every alliance came with strings. Every victory left a scar. When the Bulgars pressed from the north, the Byzantines responded not with armies, but with marriage. Princesses traded for peace. When the Rus appeared on the Black Sea, wild and brutal, they were converted and baptized, transforming future foes into Christian allies. The empire had learned the cruel truth. To live in a world of wolves, one must become a fox. But beneath the cunning, the empire's soul was fracturing. The theological battles that once defined its identity over Christ's nature, icons, and divine will began to tear it apart. The iconoclast controversy was no mere debate over art. It was a civil war of the spirit. Emperors ordered icons destroyed, monasteries burned, and monks exiled. Others restored them, declaring that images were not idols, but windows to heaven. Brother fought brother not over land or gold, but over the face of God. Even as the dust settled, Byzantium's borders kept shrinking. By the 11th century, new threats emerged, first the Bulgars, then the Seljuk Turks. In 1071, at Manzikert, the unthinkable happened. Emperor Romanus IV marched east to reclaim lost Anatolia and instead watched his army collapse. The defeat shattered centuries of security. The heartland of the empire was now open, its farms and cities falling one by one. The phoenix had been burned again. Desperate, the Byzantines looked west for help, to their estranged cousins in Rome. The result was a pact that would haunt them. Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade was born from Byzantine pleas, and for a time, salvation seemed near. Crusader armies helped repel the Turks and restore imperial ground. Yet something darker stirred beneath this uneasy alliance. The Latin West saw Byzantium not as kin, but as heretic. To them, the Greeks were effeminate, treacherous, corrupted by luxury, and so, faith became a weapon once more, this time turned inward within Christendom itself. Byzantium, which had once united Europe and the East through trade, culture, and belief, became a bridge to be burned. The final betrayal came in 1204, when the Fourth Crusade, called to liberate Jerusalem, was diverted to Constantinople. What began as a campaign of faith ended as a sack of greed. Crusader knights, supposed brothers in Christ, stormed the greatest city in Christendom. They looted its relics, desecrated its churches, melted its icons, and tore the gilded mosaics from Hagia Sophia. Chroniclers wrote of drunken soldiers sitting on the patriarch's throne, mocking the liturgy while fires consumed the city's libraries and palaces. For 3 days, Constantinople burned. Priceless treasures of the ancient and Christian world vanished in smoke. The Byzantine Empire, for the first time in 9 centuries, ceased to exist. In its place stood a patchwork of Latin kingdoms and broken Greek principalities. Yet, even then, the empire refused to die. From the city of Nicaea, a remnant survived, a handful of scholars, generals, and monks determined to restore what was lost. They would rebuild the administration, preserve the texts of antiquity, and hold onto their identity with the stubborn pride of a people who had already survived the impossible. 57 years later, they returned. The Palaiologos dynasty reclaimed Constantinople in 1261, a ghost of its former self but alive nonetheless. The once golden city was scarred, its population halved, its wealth plundered, yet still it stood, a flickering flame against the darkness. But this rebirth came too late. The world had changed. The Italians now ruled the seas, the Turks, the land. The empire that once connected continents was now hemmed in, a relic admired and pitied in equal measure. And so, as the sun set over the battered walls of Constantinople, the Byzantines stood once again at the edge of oblivion. Clever, devout, and weary, they had survived Persians, Arabs, and Crusaders. But on the horizon, a new power was rising, one that would not just threaten their borders, but consume their world entirely. The Ottomans were coming. When Constantinople was retaken in 1261, it was not the triumphant restoration the world might imagine. The empire's banners once again flew over the Golden Horn, but the city they reclaimed was a ruin. The marble streets were cracked, the palaces looted, the Hagia Sophia stripped bare. Once this was the envy of the world, the queen of cities. Now it was a faded widow dressed in the tattered robes of former glory. The Byzantine Empire had survived, yes, but only in name. The new rulers, the Palaiologos dynasty, inherited a shadow of the old realm. The empire's territories had been reduced to pockets, parts of Greece, a few Aegean islands, and the crumbling capital itself. The treasury was empty, its armies were mercenaries, its ships few and fragile. Yet in this diminished world, something remarkable happened, a spark of brilliance that refused to die. Byzantium became a candle burning at both ends. While its borders shrank, its culture reached sublime heights. Scholars like George Gemistos Plethon and Manuel Chrysoloras revived classical learning, unearthing forgotten texts of Plato, Aristotle, and Ptolemy. Artists, working in gold leaf and fading light, filled churches with mosaics that shimmered like celestial visions. Even as the empire decayed, its spirit reached for the eternal. It was a contradiction that defined its final century. The Byzantines were poor in silver, but rich in soul. Every church built in this era, every illuminated manuscript, seemed to resist time itself. The empire, long accustomed to war and politics, turned inward, toward theology, philosophy, and art. Its scholars debated the essence of the divine while its borders dissolved. Yet the outside world was not still. To the west, Italy was awakening. The Renaissance, born from the rediscovered knowledge carried by Byzantine refugees, began to stir. As Constantinople's libraries grew silent, Florence's and Venice's began to sing. The empire's death would give birth to Europe's rebirth. To the east, a different kind of power was rising, one forged in steel and faith: the Ottoman Turks. What began as a small frontier principality under Osman would, within a century, become an unstoppable empire. They learned, adapted, and absorbed. Warriors guided by the belief that conquest was divine duty. One by one, they took Byzantine cities: Nicaea, Adrianople, Thessaloniki. Constantinople stood as the last island in a sea of Ottoman green. Inside its walls, the Byzantine emperors ruled more like mayors than monarchs. They no longer commanded legions or provinces, only the loyalty of a weary people who clung to memory. To survive, emperors bartered relics and jewels. Gold icons were sold to Venice, manuscripts to Italy, saints' bones to the highest bidder. The empire that once measured its wealth in continents now traded its holiness for coin. And still, they refused to surrender their dignity. In the twilight years, one question haunted the empire: should they reconcile with the Catholic West? The schism between East and West had stood since 1054, dividing Christendom along lines of doctrine, pride, and politics. Now, with the Ottomans pressing at their gates, Byzantine emperors considered what their ancestors would have called unthinkable: submitting to the Pope's authority in exchange for Western aid. The debate tore the empire apart. In grand councils and candlelit cathedrals, bishops and monks argued with ferocity that mirrored the empire's fading heartbeat. The Unionists pleaded that survival demanded compromise. Better to kneel before Rome than fall to the crescent. The traditionalists spat back: better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat. It was not merely a theological quarrel, it was identity itself on trial. For 1,000 years, the Byzantines had seen themselves as the true heirs of Rome, the defenders of orthodoxy, God's chosen empire on earth. To bow to Rome would be to confess defeat not only of the body, but of the soul. While the church debated, the Sultan marched. Mehmed II, only 21 years old, was no ordinary conqueror. Educated, calculating, and ruthlessly ambitious, He saw Constantinople not as a city, but as destiny. There is only one empire, he is said to have declared, and only one God grants it. In 1452, he began his final preparations. Across the Bosporus, on the Asian shore, he built the massive fortress of Rumeli Hisara. Its cannons pointed directly at the city's lifeline, the sea lanes that brought food and hope. Constantinople watched in silence, powerless to intervene. They had seen many sieges, but none like this. By April 1453, the Ottoman army, perhaps 80,000 strong, encircled the city. Against them stood perhaps 7,000 defenders, including a handful of foreign volunteers. The last emperor, Constantine V the Palaiologos, ruled not as a monarch, but as a captain, fighting among his men on the walls. He knew the odds, yet his resolve was the echo of centuries, the stubborn defiance of an empire that refused to die quietly. The siege lasted 53 days. Cannons thundered against the ancient Theodosian walls, the pride of Rome's engineers. These were no ordinary weapons. The basilica cannon, cast by a Hungarian named Urban, was a monster of bronze capable of hurling stone balls weighing half a ton. Each shot shook the city like an earthquake. Churches trembled, mosaics cracked, and the air filled with dust and prayer. Night after night, the defenders patched what they could. Women carried stones and buckets of mortar. Monks sang hymns as they worked. At dawn, they would face new assaults. Scaling ladders, burning arrows, tunnels dug beneath the walls. Inside, fear mingled with faith. The people held processions with icons and relics, begging for divine intervention. They still believed that God would not abandon his city, that some miracle would save the Queen of Cities, as it always had before, but this time no fire rained from heaven. No angel turned back the tide. On May 28th, the night before the final assault, Emperor Constantine gathered his men in the palace. Chroniclers say he addressed them not as subjects but as brothers. The time has come. Remember that you are fighting for your faith, your city, your families, and the empire of your ancestors. Then he went to Hagia Sophia, the same church built by Justinian nearly 1,000 years before, and took communion one last time. The next morning, at dawn, the final attack began. Waves of Ottoman soldiers hurled themselves at the breaches. Cannon smoke covered the rising sun. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and cries in dozens of tongues filled the air. The Byzantines fought like men possessed. Every street a battlefield, every moment a last stand. When the walls finally gave way, Constantine was seen one last time in the melee near the gate of St. Romanos. Casting off his imperial regalia, he shouted, "The city is fallen, but I live not as emperor," and disappeared into the crush of battle. His body was never found. By noon, the banner of the crescent flew over the towers. The Hagia Sophia, once the greatest church in Christendom, was turned into a mosque. The streets ran red. The city's treasures were taken as spoils. For 3 days, Constantinople, the last jewel of the Roman world, was drowned in fire and silence. When Mehmed entered the city, he found not a rival, but a prize that would crown his empire. He walked into Hagia Sophia and ordered the muezzin to recite the call to prayer. Then he stood alone beneath the vast dome, gazing up at the faded mosaics of Christ and Mary, and murmured lines from a Persian poet. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in the tower of Afrasiab. So ended the Byzantine Empire, not in sudden collapse, but in a long, beautiful decay. It had endured 1,000 years beyond its western twin, carrying the torch of Rome through darkness and chaos. In its fall, the Middle Ages themselves seemed to die, giving birth to the world that would follow. But Byzantium's light did not vanish. It merely changed form. Its scholars fled to Italy, carrying with them the manuscripts of Greece and Rome. Its architects inspired the domes of Florence. Its theology shaped the Orthodox faith that still thrives from the Balkans to Siberia. Even its death echo became creation, a reminder that no civilization, however divine it believes itself to be, escapes time. The empire of gold and faith became dust and legend, yet beneath that dust lies the truth, that in the final twilight of Byzantium, the world inherited its dawn. When the last echo of cannon fire faded over Constantinople in 1453, it might have seemed that Byzantium had vanished from the earth. The city that had once held the world between its walls was silent. Yet in truth, the empire never truly died. It simply changed its shape, dissolving into the bloodstream of history. Its body was gone, but its spirit migrated into churches, books, paintings, and ideas that would shape the modern world. The Renaissance, often described as Europe's rebirth, was, in many ways, Byzantium's afterlife. When scholars fled the fallen city, they carried with them the wisdom of antiquity, manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and Euclid that had survived only because Byzantine monks had copied and preserved them for centuries. These refugees, such as Bessarion and Chrysoloras, became teachers in the academies of Florence and Venice. They opened the eyes of Western Europe to the forgotten brilliance of Greece and Rome. It was Byzantium, paradoxically, that resurrected classical civilization just as it died. The domes of Florence, the perspective of Raphael's paintings, even the humanism that fueled the Renaissance, all were nourished by Byzantine soil. The world did not know it, but the ghost of Constantinople was whispering in every scholar's pen, every architect's dream. Meanwhile, to the east, another inheritance took root. Orthodox Christianity, the faith that had sustained Byzantium through siege and schism, endured. From Russia to the Balkans, its liturgy, art, and theology carried the unmistakable imprint of the Byzantine mind. Moscow, claiming to be the Third Rome, saw itself as heir to the empire's sacred mission. The onion domes that now define Eastern Europe are echoes of the Hagia Sophia's vast curves. Its chants and rituals still breathe the same rhythms that once filled the streets of Constantinople, and in Istanbul, the Ottoman name for the ancient city, the Byzantine heart, continues to beat beneath layers of time. Hagia Sophia, that eternal monument of human faith and ingenuity, still stands. Over the centuries, it has been a church, a mosque, a museum, and once again, a mosque. Yet through every transformation, its dome remains a symbol of something greater than conquest or creed. To walk beneath its arches is to feel the presence of both worlds, the Rome that was and the Islam that followed. Yet for centuries, the West turned its back on Byzantium. Historians dismissed it as decadent, corrupt, or stagnant, a pale imitation of Rome, suffocated by ceremony and theology. Edward Gibbon, the great chronicler of Rome's decline, called the Byzantines servile, effeminate, and contemptible. To him, and to many who followed, the empire's 1,000 years of endurance seemed less a triumph than a tedious epilogue. But that view says more about those who wrote it than those who lived it. The Enlightenment prized reason over faith, and so it scorned a civilization built upon the fusion of the two. Byzantium did not fit the narrative of progress. It existed in the in-between, between Rome and modernity, between Europe and Asia, between pagan wisdom and Christian revelation. It was too subtle, too complicated, too alive with paradox. Only in recent generations has the world begun to look again, to see Byzantium not as a relic, but as a missing link in our story. Scholars now recognize it as the bridge that carried the ancient world across the dark centuries into the modern age. Its bureaucracy inspired modern governance. Its diplomacy shaped international law. Its art and theology still ripple through Orthodox and Catholic traditions alike. The forgotten empire was never forgotten at all, merely hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. But beyond its achievements lies something deeper, a warning written in gold and blood. The Byzantines believed themselves chosen, eternal, unshakable, yet they fractured from within long before the walls fell. Faith turned to faction, pride to paralysis. They debated the nature of God while the enemy built cannons. And when unity was most needed, they found only division. Their fall was not simply a military defeat. It was an unraveling of identity. The Byzantines forgot what made them strong, their ability to adapt, to synthesize worlds. Once they had been the bridge between civilizations. In the end, they built walls instead. And so the story of Byzantium lingers as both inspiration and caution. It reminds us that civilization is not a fortress but a flame, one that must be tended, not taken for granted. Knowledge, faith, art, and power are threads in a delicate weave. When arrogance or fear pulls one too tightly, the whole tapestry frays. Today's world, divided by belief and ambition, faces questions the Byzantines once knew well. What happens when faith becomes politics? When identity becomes a cage? When alliances built for survival turn into chains of resentment? History rarely repeats itself, but it often rhymes. And in that rhyme, Byzantium's voice can still be heard. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the empire. Not its marble, nor its gold, but its memory. The knowledge that no power, however divine it imagines itself, is beyond decay. And that beauty, even in decline, can illuminate the path forward. For in the fall of Constantinople, something paradoxical was born. The Middle Ages ended. The modern world began. The empire of faith became a story of endurance, reminding every generation that even in ruin, the light of the East still glows. Fragile, flickering, but unextinguished. Byzantium may be gone, but its echoes remain. In our books, our cities, and our longing for meaning amid the march of time. Its lesson is simple and eternal. Empires die not only when enemies break their walls, but when they forget who they are.